Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. This week on the GardenDC podcast, we're joined by George Coombs, Director of Horticulture at Mount Cuba Center outside of Wilmington, Delaware. Welcome, George.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, and we're going to dive into everything phlox for the garden. But before we do that, one of our traditional questions here at the GardenDC podcast is to ask our guests, were they born with chlorophyll in their veins or a green thumb? Were you a gardener from birth, or did you come to it later in life?
I do think that it's a little bit of a genetics game with me. I actually grew up on a farm, a long line of farmers. Potato farm is what my family did when I was growing up, and they still do to this day. So I guess it was always kind of meant to be in some respects.
And where was that farm located?
I was actually in southern New Jersey.
So not too far away from where you are now.
Nope.
And then you went to school for horticulture, or did you take another direction in your career?
No, yeah. So when I was looking for, what I wanted to do with my life, I knew I didn't want to farm. I, had plenty of experience there and knew that wasn't for me. But, having an interest in plants, I was exposed to horticulture and plant science kinds of careers in like a high school FFA program. And from there, I went to the University of Delaware to pursue a degree in plant science. Ultimately, I kind of found my home in public horticulture from an internship that I did at Longwood Gardens while I was in school. And I did a kind of a circuitous route kind of in between time, but eventually landed back here at Mount Cuba, kind of working in that public garden sphere, managing our trial program.
And we'll get into the trial program in a little bit, but I know you had a few years for commercial growers. Can you talk about your experience there?
Yeah, so my first job after I finished college was working for a large wholesale nursery outside of the Chicago area. And for them, I was basically doing a lot of just kind of record keeping and office work, but also grew into a greenhouse production role where we forced hydrangeas and roses to bloom for sales at garden centers at Mother's Day. So we kind of grow them very, 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 very slowly through the winter months to keep them, alive and kind of thriving, but then kind of crank up the heat at the last minute to get them to come into bloom right in time for Mother's Day sales.
Cool.
And so from there, I decided Chicago was really just way too cold for me. Growing up in southern New Jersey, that was a level of winter I was not made for. So I ended up moving back to this part of the world and was working at a local garden center, growing plants for growing perennials, basically, for them to sell at the garden center. And then from there, I joined Mount Cuba.
And you've been with Mount Cuba, I think, almost 10 years now, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's hard to believe. It's been a whirlwind.
Time flies. So going back to that trial program, did that program start when you joined Mount Cuba, or has that been in effect for a while?
So our trial program actually started in the early 2000s. And the reason for that is the trial garden, when it was the kind of the space that we used, was actually prior to our trial program used as the cut flower garden. And after Mrs. Copeland, our founder, passed away, there was really kind of no need for cut flower production here at Mount Cuba. So the space was repurposed into this kind of trial program. And the goal of it, being Mount Cuba Center and being focused on native plants, the idea was to test how some of these native plants would grow in just a traditional type of garden environment, so that we can make recommendations to homeowners about what they would be most successful with. Um, and so in the early 2000s, our first trial that we did was on different types of asters. So we grow out a bunch of different species and cultivars of asters, and after a period of 3 years, would make recommendations about which ones did really well. And that trial went really well, and we did our first trial of coneflowers right after that. And after those first two trials, the program was really well received, and it was clear that it was of value to gardeners and to the nursery industry as well. That our Mount Cuba Center kind of made an investment into the trial garden and expanded it and kind of renovated the space so it was a little more useful, but also beautiful at the same time. And so it added a structure to trial shade-loving plants. And after that construction process was finished is when I was kind of brought on to take care of that new space and to run the program.
I love that you said it's a 3-year trial before you do the report, because I think that's really important for home gardeners to know that you're not just evaluating one growing season.
Yeah, and it's interesting. With every trial that we've done, I almost kind of say that the first year is really like it's a buy year. You get a lot of data from it, and you can kind of start to learn and understand the plants. But the first year performance is usually not the one that's like most indicative of what the final result or the final kind of recommendation might be. It's usually, it just takes some time for perennials to get established and for them to grow to the size and scale that they would as a mature plant. And also for the kinds of pests and disease to show up in the garden space as well, and kind of put them through their pacers of what the real world kind of experience for a homeowner would be.
And everything you're trialing in your gardens are first a perennial, correct? A herbaceous perennial, and then some native straight species as well as the cultivars that are available on the market, correct?
Yeah, so historically, most of our trials have been, herbaceous perennials. In a few instances, trying to kind of be as complete as possible. Well, first, let me back up. So our trials have generally been focused around a genus. So taking a whole group of plants, like phlox or like Monarda or Coreopsis, and growing out as many different of the native species and their related cultivars as possible. Sometimes, for the sake of completeness, we'll throw in an annual or kind of semi-annual, almost biennial plant in there as well. But for the most part, herbaceous perennials. We have started trialing some woody plants recently. So we're actually kind of near the tail end of our first trial of smooth hydrangea. So that'll be the kind of first instance of doing something that's bigger than a perennial, but for the most part, perennials.
Yeah, and I almost consider smooth hydrangea because it is, it's kind of on that edge. Like,
Yeah,
because you do give it kind of a hard cut back, and it's almost treated similarly to perennial, a herbaceous perennial, like in your garden.
yeah, that's why we thought it'd be a good place to start. It's a
Hmm.
good transition, good warm up into the truer kind of more traditional woody type plants.
And before we jump into everything phlox, let's talk a little bit about the other collections available at Mount Cuba. So when you come to visit, you still see some of the past trials that are up there. I've visited a few times, and I love to look at the heucheras and the other things side by side and evaluate them. But there's also some historic collection. There's a lilac grove, correct?
Yeah, there's a lilac alley. When the Copeland family they first moved in the late 30s. There were just kind of a few garden elements that were installed immediately, and then the Second World War broke out, and kind of garden development didn't really move forward very quickly. And one of the first things that was installed when the Copelands moved in was our lilac alley. It's been renovated, a couple of times since that kind of initial planting, so the plants aren't original, but the garden feature itself is something that we do maintain, even though it's not native, because it does kind of speak to our founders and the kind of plants and design elements that were in fashion at that time.
Hmm. And when visiting Mount Cuba, if you can catch the timing right, when the lilacs are at peak, which I'm going to say is what, mid May, or maybe even earlier in May.
Yeah, I would say it's usually early May. Sometimes
Hmm.
if it's a warm spring, maybe a little bit into late April.
Hmm. And when you come to visit, you have an enchanting front gate. I'm going to call it that.
Mm.
That you need to stop and look at that front gate when you come in because that's just beautiful. And then on the drive up the mountain, and I'm going to put mountain in air quotes here, right, George?
Yes.
What is the elevation of Mount Cuba?
So the highest point at Mount Cuba is actually the second highest point in all of Delaware. So we
Hmm.
will take our status as a mountain. Um, and I believe we are right around 405 feet above sea level.
Hmm. And yeah, the winding road up the hill, or mountain, as we say, you're going to encounter some other beautiful plantings. I think there's like a scree or rock garden,
Yep.
and that you can pull over a little bit and look at that. And then when you get to the top, you get to the house and the visitor center per se, and check in there. And then there's a formal garden around the home, and then it's mostly woodland natives. Kind of in a forested area, and in the last few years, you've expanded the meadows, correct?
Yeah, so much of the naturalistic gardens is kind of where our like spring ephemerals are really just a jaw-dropping display. So that time period, visiting for the lilacs is really when all of those woodland ephemerals are blooming at their peak as well. And so we have like an amazing collection of trillium and just lots of like rare kinds of just beautiful native plants that most people don't get to see, and you certainly don't get to see them in the kind of the quantities and scale that they're used at Mount Cuba. So that's a really special moment, and yeah, the kind of meadow areas that we've opened up are actually our trails experience, and so that's taking people out into our natural areas. Mount Cuba, the garden is relatively small. It's probably only 20 to 30 acres, but Mount Cuba Center owns and maintains over 1,000 acres of property, and so that trails experience is kind of giving people. I think it's almost a 2 mile circuit if you do the longest version of it. Um, kind of just a nice hike through our larger natural spaces, which are mostly meadow, but also you can see a lot of woodland spaces too.
Mm. And that might be something for this time of year into fall to really come back to Mount Cuba and see if you'd already visited and seen the spring ephemerals in the early springtime or mid springtime. And I've been so lucky, George, to hit the spring ephemeral displays right at peak. And I want to say that that's usually between April 20th to 29th, somewhere in there. Is usually perfect depending on the weather each year, of course, and
Yep.
how things go. And I'm going to say the word exquisite for the collection that you have there of woodland native ephemerals, because it's almost like walking into a fairyland where, each and every trillium seems to have a little spotlight on it. And it's just, otherworldly is another word I'll use for it.
It really is. I mean, our gardeners do a great job, and like we mentioned, I've been here for almost 10 years, and I'll tell you, like every spring, it's still mind-blowingly beautiful. Like, how can I work here? How can this be possible? You'd think, some of that would get old after a period of time, but it never does.
No, I can't imagine it ever does. And that you're right off of I-95. You're not too
Yep.
far away from that, so fairly accessible and easy to get to. But I do want to ask a Debbie Downer question now, George, about the collection, and that's deer. So I know you must be in a heavy deer pressure situation in that corridor.
We do. I mean, like a lot of suburban America, deer pressure is a big deal here, and we're fortunate enough that the garden is surrounded by a deer fence. That's not to say they still don't get in. To be honest with you, we've seen them just walk right through the up the driveway through the gates, just like all the other visitors. Um, but we're fortunate enough that we do have kind of a nuisance hunting permit, that we have an extended deer season where we can kind of hunt and harvest the deer when visitors aren't here, to kind of reduce that pressure. But in our natural areas where the deer fence obviously isn't excluding them, it's a big problem, and it's a concern for a lot of gardeners in our region.
Yeah, I think a lot of our eastern woodland natives and ephemerals that you would see walking in even your neighborhood parks have just completely disappeared because of that deer population pressure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone, but what they found when they did that the wolves kind of pushed the deer away up higher into the mountains, and so they were getting like all of this like lush herbaceous regeneration, and it ended up like the streams were becoming wooded, which led to like the river waters becoming cooler and more fish, and it was just this whole like cascading effect of by kind of introducing wolves and thereby removing the deer pressure. The ecosystem really kind of healed and changed. And so, unfortunately, wolves in kind of suburban Delaware is probably not in our cards, but the deer pressure is definitely damaging, to be sure.
We'll keep on rebalancing and hope that, Mother Nature works it out and we can get more of those natives back into our parklands and back into our home gardens and more of that. So, turning to the Phlox trial, and this particular trial was done a couple years ago, and it's titled Phlox for Sun. So, those who are familiar with the early spring phlox, the woodland phlox or ground cover ones, this study is in particular about the tall phlox, correct?
Yeah, so there's several different species of phlox, and we didn't have room for all of them.
Hmm.
That would have been kind of quite daunting. But we tried to kind of include the species and the types that most home gardeners would come across, shopping for plants. And so the phlox for sun is really kind of focuses on Phlox paniculata, or garden phlox, or tall garden phlox. But there's a lot of kind of other species, shorter species and things that are very different but bloom at a kind of similar time, that you might think of them kind of in the same ballpark with those more common plants.
So the majority focus for the study was Phlox paniculata, and I'm going to mangle some of the Latin, but it also covered Phlox maculata, Phlox carolina, Phlox globerina.
Yep.
That's the one I'm going to really.
Right, you got it right. Phlox glaberrima.
uh, Phlox pilosa, Phlox pulchra, Phlox ovata, and Phlox amplifolia. I think
Yeah,
I've got them all.
you nailed it.
Yay! I made it stumbling through my horrible Latin. So, and I was just looking up all the common names for basically Phlox paniculata, and besides tall phlox, or that most people call it summer phlox, it's also called fall phlox, paradoxically.
Yeah,
So,
that
and
one
then
that one bothers me. I don't know.
mhm,
Yeah,
I don't like the fall phlox either, because I'm like it's really blooming right now, and that right now is, end of July, early August, is it's kind of putting on a great show. I prefer garden phlox or tall phlox.
yeah, me too.
I think those are the better. But common names is, it's colloquial. It's what you grew up with calling it. If your grandmother pointed to it and said that's fall phlox, then you're going to call it fall phlox.
Yeah,
So that's what we're talking about today. And first, I wanted to ask you, what are the criteria and what are you evaluating for? Like when you have, I imagine there's grad students or interns or others going out there with little notepads or iPads and collecting data. What is the data that they're looking for your study?
sure. So for all of our trials, we're really looking at garden performance. So that can mean a lot of different things, and it depends on the trial. But are they sturdy? Do they bloom well? Are they disease resistant? If that's a disease that's a problem for them. So with phlox in particular, we are looking at like powdery mildew resistance. Um, things like spider mites are another pest. But just kind of overall, how healthy and resilient are these plants? Um, but another thing that we look at that kind of sets Mount Cuba's trial program apart is looking at their kind of ecological value. And so with phlox, we were looking at the pollinators that visit these plants, and in particular butterflies, and just trying to see, um, are certain cultivars or even species attracting more butterflies than others, and if so, trying to kind of learn, well, what is it that's driving those differences. So that's just a really kind of fascinating topic to study when you talk about native plants and
Hmm.
cultivars, and do they still have the same kind of ecological value and benefits as the straight species?
Yeah, and that is a topic that has a little bit of controversy attached to that. So there are some native purists who say only the straight species, only that, and that's the only one that's really beneficial. But I think your studies have done a great job of showing that some of the cultivars um, can perform just as well. And those will be more available to the home gardener, where the straight species might not be able to be grown or even sourced by a home gardener.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it really comes down to, where are you going to use this plant? And for most people in their home garden, I think that, whatever you can find to, at your local garden center, or, from whoever, you shouldn't feel guilty about using a cultivar, particularly if it's one that has been demonstrated to kind of, have those benefits and those functions. It gets a little bit different as you move out into kind of natural spaces or doing restoration work where you want a population to kind of self-sustain and evolve with the community there. So it's kind of a question of context, really. But the exciting kind of results from our work is that a lot of these cultivars, do provide really good kind of ecological services, at least to pollinators. That's kind of what we've been able to study most directly. In the case of the phlox trial, we actually had a cultivar called Gina, um, which was like attracting all of the butterflies in the trial to almost to the exclusion of every other thing. Um, so there was clearly something special about Gina that the butterflies were enjoying, and this was a cultivar that was selected by a woman, and was kind of really noticed for its disease resistance, not necessarily its pollinator value, at least at first, and then was kind of introduced to the nursery trade because of that. So it's just kind of an interesting example of how it's not a black and white question all the time, and that you kind of need to do science like this um, to be able to feel confident about what are your plants able to do and not able to do.
So true, and such a great point that context matters. And it is not black and white, it is so layered. And we're finding out more and more, right, every day about plants and their relationships to their environment, their relationships to each other. There's so much that needs to be studied still, that either we just don't have the funding or the time to find out. But it's so fascinating what little research we do have available. So Mount Cuba is doing a great job with that. And one side note before we dive too much into flux, for listeners outside of the Mid Atlantic or DC area, I just wanted to note that the Mount Cuba Center is located near Wilmington, Delaware, which makes it in USDA Hardiness Zone A/6B, and that the soil there, correct, George, is a clay loam for the
Yeah.
trial garden. And I'm reading here that there's an average pH of 6.5. So that's good to know, because if you have different soils, you're going to get different results. And you do not use pesticides at all during the trial, which is terrific. And of course, would be counter to finding out how many pollinators arrived at your plants if you did use pesticides. But it also wouldn't help you with the evaluation for, say, powdery mildew if you used, or for the spider mites issue. And then the plants are watered as needed just the first year, but not afterwards. And I think that's a great point, because many times people are sold a bill of goods that native plants don't need to be watered at all or are drought tolerant, and that is just not the case.
It is not, no. We really, with all of our trials, we try to take care of them the way the average homeowner would, myself included. And many people may think that, oh, as a professional, I'm out there, babying my plants at every moment of the day. But I'm just like everybody else, where for the most part, like, when I plant a plant, I'll water it initially, and, maybe I'll come back and remember to water it once or twice kind of during that establishment period, that first year. But after that, it's on its own, and we want to see how these plants perform in that kind of level of care, not as like, giving them the most attention possible, but as, what can a realistically um, you know, normal homeowner experience, what would that look like? Um, so that's what we try and do.
And I think the big difference though in your child garden from say a home garden is that you have them planted in rows and well labeled. So when you do visit, you see one plant after another of the same genus, or all the phlox together, all the heuchera together, so you can compare them side by side, which would be unusual for a home garden, so to speak.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't make for the most beautiful backyard or anything like that. But I mean, that is a good point to make. That a lot of times, particularly with the pest and disease issues that we see and the kind of the severity of them, it's exaggerated from what a homeowner is likely to see, just because we have literally like 500 phlox plants within a relatively small square foot of space. And so, that level of like disease pressure is just not anything close to what the average person is going to see. Um,
Hmm.
so that's good and bad. It's good because it really, stresses the plants. It's kind of like a stress test you might get at a doctor, where you want to see like how tough are they. It's not that it just got lucky and didn't encounter any disease. It's these are plants that really excel despite of it. But the bad side of it is just that some of the ratings that we give may be a little harsher because of that increased disease pressure. So people may have a more generous experience with some of the plants that aren't necessarily in our top performers.
Hmm. And what do you think about the fact that since they're side by side with, say, other phlox or other heuchera or other echinacea, that slightly can skew the results versus being in a mixed matrix type garden or a home border of mixed perennials and woody plants?
I think it does change the value of the rating. What I feel like is consistent, though, is the relative ranking. And
Hmm.
so I feel confident that the plants that we have denoted to be like the best performers are probably going to be the best performers in any kind of context. Um, just because they're tough, they're disease resistant, they're usually kind of more capable to handle stresses in general. Um, More vigorous plants, if you will.
Hmm.
The thing about if you were to use them in like a mixed planting or a matrix planting, I think that they might behave differently, but they would probably still behave very well or perform very well.
Good to know. Yeah, and I would think what you're putting them through is a little more, as you say, stressful than the home gardener. You're usually not going to stick one tall phlox by itself with nothing around it and maybe a bit of
No, yeah,
mulch. Um, in that case, they literally have to stand on its own. And when it does stand on its own, you get to evaluate it and look at it from 360 degrees all around, and that's pretty tough on a plant.
yeah. I always like to say, with tall phlox, especially the taller varieties, even if you do get a little bit of disease, it's usually going to happen on the lower parts of the plant, and so those kind of lower leaves can look a little ratty and um, just not their best. So it's always nice to plant kind of relatively tall or medium sized plants around a taller phlox like that. So when some of those leaves do fall off, you, for the most part, don't even see it.
Hmm.
So good neighbors are the secret to success.
I also call that the underskirt or the petticoat
Yep.
part of some of the plants that you want to cover up. You're like,
Yep.
don't leave those bare stems naked, because there are a few that you're like, ooh, it's just not attractive down there.
Yeah.
So that's good. And let's talk about perfect growing conditions for phlox for in the home garden. So we're talking about phlox for sun. So I'm going to guess the first thing would be full day sun. And do you define that as 6 hours, 8 hours? What's a full day of sun?
We do define it as 6 hours. I think, a little bit more than six is probably the best. I would say 8 hours, 8 to 10 was really where you want to be with phlox. Um, the trick to them overall, though, having a healthy phlox is about having consistently moist soil. Um, in kind of natural spaces where you might find these plants growing wild, they usually grow like along river courses or floodplains where the soil is relatively moist at all times. And that's just going to help them, weather through, stresses in your environment. So what we have found is, not having that kind of condition in our trial garden, that once it does start to get dry, that's when we start to see, kind of really severe impacts from powdery mildew or spider mites or other pests, really start to move in and kind of capitalize that on that weak moment with the plant. So it's really about consistent moisture. And so if you don't have really consistent moisture, I would err towards the side of less sun, a little bit. Certainly not going towards less than 6 hours, but I think having a little bit less sunlight on them can kind of preserve whatever moisture is in the ground a little bit longer.
So we talked about your soil in the trial garden being a clay loam mix. Do
Mhm.
you do any amendment or recommend any amendment for growing phlox?
I don't think anything is needed. I mean, they definitely, being relatively large plants will benefit from rich soils. So, adding some compost in is always a beneficial thing that does typically help with kind of creating a more moisture retentive soil. But it's not required. So I think that they can handle a lot of soil types, so long as it doesn't get too dry.
And most phlox, the cultivars that are available on the market, are, I'm going to guess, between 3 and 4 feet. It's not going to be over your head or anything. But if you wanted a shorter phlox, there are dwarf varieties available, correct?
Correct, and that's actually where a lot of the kind of newer cultivars generally, are headed. I think that breeders and garden centers and nursery professionals tend to prefer these kind of more compact cultivars because they look better when you buy them in a pot at the garden center. Certainly prettier than like a 4 foot tall perennial, like barely hanging on in a small 1 gallon pot. Um, but interestingly, what we found in our trial is that a lot of those plants did not do very well. And it may be part of like how our trial garden is set up, but um, we noticed that those were a lot more prone to disease and leaf drop. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we mulch our trial garden with like shredded wood mulch. And so there's a lot of actual like reflected heat there in the summertime, especially, in the hotter weeks. Um, and just the fact that that entire plant is literally, just a couple feet off of that hot mulch surface, um, I think they tend to suffer a lot more than the plants who are 4 feet up in the air. It can kind of get you a little bit of a breeze, and the foliage is just cooler and seems to operate a lot better.
Interesting. And if you wanted a shorter plant, say you have one of the older, taller varieties, can you give it what's called that Chelsea chop around mid-May and still have blooms later in the summer? Or did you do any testing or trialing for cutting them back?
We didn't do any testing in the trial, but I can tell you that in other areas we um, do the Chelsea chop, and we actually do it on that cultivar Gina that I mentioned, which is typically, if you were to kind of let it do its thing naturally, it would get to be about 5 feet tall. But by kind of just cutting it back in half, in mid May or so, late May, would probably only get to be about 3.5 feet tall. So if there are any like plants that are just too tall, or maybe get a little floppy in a thunderstorm, that's a really great tool to kind of reduce their height, but you still get the same kind of floral display as you would otherwise.
Yeah, that's great advice. And also, are you cutting back the entire plants in the fall, or are you waiting till late winter, early spring?
We would typically cut them back in the fall just because by that point in our trial, they looked pretty rough. Um, there wasn't a whole lot left standing. But it's always good to, I think, leave any kind of large plant material up through the wintertime, it's helped create cover. And um, a lot of times insects will use kind of the dying stem as a place to lay eggs. I don't know specifically if phlox kind of fall into that category, but it never hurts to kind of leave them up longer.
Yeah, true. And I do think actually I saw a study where the phlox stem, because it is that nice tall hollow stem, is used by overwintering insects up to about the 18-inch, 24-inch mark. So you
Yep.
could cut off the tops if it was really unsightly, but just leave the kind of the sticks up there for the winter time, and then cut that back again in late winter. Early, very early spring, like definitely by March 15th or so.
Yeah.
And so let's turn to the trial results. And you already let the cat out of the bag with Gina being the star, right? So, what are some of the other great performers from the trial?
Well, I think there's more to be said about Gina too,
Hmm.
because not only was it attracting all the butterflies to the plant, kind of to the exclusion of everything else, but it was even if that never happened, even if it didn't have a single butterfly on it, it still would have been the best plant just because it was so healthy. It never had a spot of mildew on it in the entire 3-year period of the trial, which, I mean, this garden was like, powdery mildew station. It was everywhere. It was like a bomb had gone off. So it was severe. And the fact that, this plant would not get mildew, even being surrounded by that level of disease pressure, was incredible. It was a vigorous plant. It bulked up quickly. Um, and it just, it didn't miss a beat. It didn't fall over and flop. It didn't have any negatives to it, and it was just truthfully one of the best plants that I've ever kind of evaluated in that trial program, in terms of overall performance. So I can't say enough good things about it.
So
If
Gina gets the gold medal.
Yeah, totally. If there's like one bad thing about it, is that I don't think it has a very strong fragrance.
Mm.
I never noticed it. I don't have the greatest sense of smell or the most sensitive nose, but you know, nobody's perfect, so
Hmm.
so that's okay. But in terms of other plants, I think Glamour Girl was a cultivar that did really well. It's a little on the shorter side, only gets to be about 3 feet tall, but has these really kind of vibrant, um, like kind of cherry pink colored flowers. Um, Another cultivar that does really great is called Delta Snow, and so this is actually an old pass along plant from the Mississippi region, and it's hard to say why, but it was very disease resistant in our trial, and so I suspect that that's why people kind of shared this with one another down in that region. And being kind of a hot and humid climate, it definitely had to be something special in order for people to notice it there. But that's a really great cultivar that kind of has these white flowers with a pink eye to them, and gets to be about 4 feet tall. So very fragrant on that one as well. Um, Another cultivar that kind of looks similar to Delta Snow with that white flower and pink eye is one that's called Lavelle. And so this is actually one that isn't readily available in the market. But the interesting thing about it, the reason that I bring it up, is that it's believed to have been a seedling from Gina. So the woman who initially found Gina had
Hmm.
it planted in her garden. A seedling popped up with these white flowers. Um, and so it was called Lavelle. And it was actually the number 2 pollinator attracting plant in our garden. So it just goes to show you that there's something special about Gina and its little baby Lavelle, that's bringing all the butterflies in. Um, we did do a kind of a more rigorous pollinator evaluation in our Phlox trial using a graduate student at the University of Delaware, and he was trying to answer that question of, like, well, what is it about Gina that's bringing all these pollinators or all these butterflies to it? And um, he evaluated the amount of nectar that was being produced and the sugar concentration of that nectar, and kind of compared it to other cultivars in the straight species. And basically what he found is that neither of those things was very different in Gina. The only thing that was different was the size of its flowers. And so Gina has very, uniquely small. They're probably only as wide as a pea. So they're much smaller than the average phlox flower, which is about, the size of a nickel. Um, and so because of that, his kind of theory, though he wasn't able to prove it, is that, the butterflies can just get to more flowers faster, um, on the plant and not have to kind of fly off and reposition or what have you. So Lavelle, kind of being a seedling of Gina, kind of has the second smallest flowers, and so it kind of tracks with that theory that that might be what's attracting them.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So each of panicle has all these individual tiny flowers, and you would think that the bigger the flower, the bigger the target for them, and that's kind of where breeding is heading. A lot for plant breeding is bigger and showier, but smaller is better here.
Yeah, it's kind of, I liken it to, it's like a buffet, for butterflies, where they can just get a sample of everything really quickly, versus having to, like, drive to three different restaurants to try three different meals.
That's a good analogy. And so, a phlox that is probably in the garden of a lot of our listeners is David, and that was named Perennial Plant of the Year back in 2002, and that was touted for its great resistance to powdery mildew. How did that stack up in your trial?
That was really good. The powdery mildew resistance was definitely there. It's a great, kind of pure white colored flower. Only gets to be about 3 feet tall, so it's a really nice kind of medium sized cultivar that works well for a lot of people.
And the great thing about David too is that it was found or sourced as a seedling in southeastern Pennsylvania. So it was from a locally sourced wild population.
Yeah, and that's something that I think was a theme that we saw with a lot of the top performers in our trial. We had, over, I think, 90 different types of phlox, over 60, different types of just phlox paniculata. Um, and a lot of the cultivars that people would come across at a garden center are plants that have been bred in Europe, in particular in Holland. And these plants, when they're going through that kind of breeding process of growing out a bunch of new seedlings and selecting the best ones and taking them to the next generation, when you're doing that in a different type of climate or with the different types of disease pressure, you're going to select for different performances than what maybe an American breeding program would select. And so there aren't really any robust American breeding programs, but there are plants that gardeners have just found or appreciated over the years, that do well in our climate, in our region, with our diseases and weather patterns. And so, Gina was found in a wild setting. Delta Snow was a pass along plant from gardeners down in the Mississippi area. Another cultivar called Robert Poor, which was one of our top performers, was just found at like an abandoned homestead in Alabama. David was kind of found here locally. So, it just kind of speaks to how observant gardeners, over the years have found plants that are really well adapted to our climate. And even though they aren't the things that people or the nursery industry really promotes because they're not the newest genetics, they, are really good, tried and true plants. And our trial kind of proved that.
So, home gardeners, be observant, and you might have a treasure somewhere there that could be sometime trialed or introduced onto the market at some point.
Yeah, you definitely could.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that story of Gina, and it's like seems so apocryphal, but so wonderful that she not only had Gina but also Lavelle come out of there too.
Yeah, it happens, and it's something that I want to encourage everybody, to just pay attention to their garden, because I think the more you notice, the more, interesting and almost magical it can seem. And it's even with the pollinator story, there's so much that we don't know about, that whole argument of cultivars versus straight species. And I think as gardeners, we've had, decades, even hundreds of years to kind of learn about, the cultural requirements of plants. But we're only just now starting to pay attention to what those plants do in that environment and who they interact with. And so I think that's kind of like the next phase of gardening, really, is just paying attention and being observant about those interactions and sharing that information with your friends, your neighbors, the people that you garden with, um, because we'll learn a lot more the more that we kind of share those observations.
So, for the other end of the trial results, are there any that you would say you would discourage home gardeners from growing from your trial results?
I always hate to badmouth plants. I think, there's certainly some that I feel like were just bad. But sometimes that can always be, maybe we just started with a really unhealthy plant or something that came in with diseases or pests. So there's sometimes reasons for something doing really poorly. So I try not to kind of badmouth something, in particular.
For those listeners who want to look up the report itself online, it's available as a PDF and you can view it on the mountcubacenter.org website and go to trials and then flocks for sun. There's a great chart that basically shows performance and all the ratings there. And I love that one of the rating categories is fragrance because I don't even actually think of phlox as being that much of a fragrant plant in the garden, say compared to lavender or roses. But that's great that that was part of the evaluation.
Yeah, it's something that, not all of them are, or at least not all of them in our trial were. And, we kind of rated it on like four categories of, one, we didn't notice anything at all. But then it could be mild, moderate, or strong. And those ones that we rated as strong were plants that would easily just smell in the air. That it's not like you have to go up and put your nose into it. Like this is something that if it was in your backyard and there was a light breeze, you would certainly smell it. So it's definitely, it's a great scent.
Hmm.
Robert Poor was probably the one that I think of as being the most fragrant. And I would plant it just for that reason, even if it didn't have beautiful flowers.
And I'll include that link to that study, the direct link in the show notes. I did want to ask that you do let the visitors come and choose their favorites. And do you use those to weigh on some of your ratings or not? Or that's just a separate category is favorite of visitors?
We used to do that, pretty regularly. I don't know that we do anymore. At least we haven't because of COVID. Just for the sake of handling supplies and whatnot. But yeah, we wanted to see what types of what plants people were gravitating towards it, and really, it was just kind of research that we wanted to be able to provide back to the nursery industry to say that, like, hey, like these are the plants that people want
Hmm.
you to sell. At the end of the day, what our trial garden wants to do is to make native plants more popular. We want to make it easy for homeowners. We want to popularize them. We want, more nurseries to grow them and just really get more native plants out there. So it was really just trying to kind of uh, connect the demand with the producers.
Amongst your staff and everybody who's working on the trials, do you ever have, and I'm going to call it a knockdown, drag out fight? So you got the results in front of you, but something could be a little subjective, right? Like something you might quibble between this and that, or is it just so very clear which ones are the stellar and which ones are the kind of the middle of the pack?
We have a pretty rigorous like numerical system that the math at the end of the day is the arbiter. It decides. There certainly have been instances where really good performing plants or plants that I personally wouldn't find attractive because of their color or habit or whatever, but um, they can still be good performers. And so we do try to take the kind of subjective aspects out of it and just kind of speak about the plant's performance and overall, just impact it has, but um, leave those kind of personal opinions up to the end user.
Probably for the best. Although I probably couldn't resist. Including a few little notes on the side. Like, look at this one. So if we come and visit Mount Cuba now. This phlox trial ended a couple years ago, but you still have some of the samples in your garden to see.
Yeah, so our trial garden has a small area where we're trying to showcase the winners from past trials, and so the phlox are all there, and we also have other plants from our Coreopsis and Monarda trials that are on display as well.
And what are the current plants being trialed?
Right. So I've already mentioned our trial on smooth hydrangeas. We're also doing a really big trial on sedges, which is pretty exciting. Probably not for the average homeowner.
Hmm.
Sedges or carex species are very grassy looking, and to a lot of people, they can all kind of look relatively similar. But it's a big group of plants. The landscape architects are utilizing a lot, and there's just so many species out there that we really don't even know which ones are best for which types of
Hmm.
places. So it's a group of plants that we're very excited to learn about and then kind of share that information um, out to the public as well. But we also have a really big trial on Vernonia or ironweeds, which they don't have the best sounding common name, but they're really beautiful plants. They're generally tall with beautiful purple flowers on them, kind of starting now, but really kind of into August and September. And we'll also have a really big, really interesting trial on goldenrods. I think, over 60 or 70 different species of goldenrod. And again, just a lot of variety that's out there that as gardeners, we just don't know that much about. So it's a really cool group of plants to learn about.
Mm. That carex trial does sound exciting. I mean, it's not a big flowering plant. Kind of looks like a little mop of grass, usually on the ground. But it's going to be so exciting to find out which are the great performers and the toughest ones and the ones that will do the best in our home gardens because carex are fairly deer proof and fairly low maintenance. I don't think I have to do anything, even water mine. So it's a great all around garden plant.
No, for sure, they're super useful, and they're kind of like the unsung heroes of a lot of
Hmm.
garden spaces.
Yeah, we might have to have you come back on just to talk about carex. When visitors come to Mount Cuba, is there anything in the garden that you would recommend them not to miss that we haven't talked about yet?
I think the one area that always resonates with our visitors is our ponds. So the
Mm.
garden area around our ponds is just it's beautiful. It's beautiful, all year long, and it's just a really serene and moving kind of scene. So definitely, check that out. You can't miss it, so you won't miss it. Um, but it's just a really beautiful space.
Yeah, I can concur. It's such a beautiful setting when you come down, and kind of the mossy lawn around it just sets it off so beautifully. And we're talking about the woodland pond, not the formal like water fountain or water garden that's up near the house.
Correct. We call that the round garden. Yeah.
Ah, and I want to thank you so much, George, for sharing the background of the trial and hints and tips for home gardeners to grow phlox. Any final advice on phlox or any favorites that we might not have mentioned yet?
Um, I will just touch on one last, my like personal
Hmm.
favorite from the whole trial, and that's a cultivar called Blue Paradise. And um, it's quite honestly not the best performer. It can get powdery mildew, so this is one that you would have to probably baby a little bit and give it some extra water. But the reason that I love it is because it has these really deep kind of violet blue flowers, and it's what they call a changeling phlox. And so for some reason, like this color, this like blue family of pigments, in the early morning sunlight and in the evening sunlight, it looks very blue, like almost like a true blue. And then during the afternoon, it becomes more of like a purpley violet color. So it's just a really kind of interesting plant. It almost looks like two different plants in the same stem. And it's very fragrant. So it's just a really cool plant, even though it takes a little bit more effort to grow.
I'm looking at the photo right now, George, and I think you've sold me on it.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. It's something different.
It's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, George.
Thank you.
Spigelia plant profile: Indian pink or pink root, Spigelia marylandica is a perennial plant that blooms in early to midsummer. It's native to the eastern United States and hardy to zones 5 through 9. Spigelia prefers neutral, well-drained soils and woodland edge conditions in light shade. Spigelia is a favorite of pollinators and is particularly attractive to hummingbirds. This plant is notoriously hard to source. Once established, it hates being transplanted. Seed collection is difficult, if not impossible. According to Rick Dark and Doug Tallamy's The Living Landscape, Spigelia seeds are dehiscent, meaning the seed capsules are propelled some distance from the mother plant to start new seedlings. 2 recent introductions have made the plant more accessible to the home gardener. They are both vegetatively propagated and available now from local independent garden centers. The first is Little Redhead, which improves on the straight species by being more tolerant of full sun conditions. It has deep red flowers held above dense clumps of dark green foliage. The other is Ragin' Cajun, which has flowers that are more orange-red. It also stays more rounded and compact, while sending out more flowers per plant than the straight native species or Little Redhead. Spigelia, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, surprise! The naked ladies have popped up. It's one of my highlights of the summer is the lycoris that come up on bare stems because their foliage had already emerged in the spring and then disappeared by this point. So they go by a lot of nicknames: British soldiers, as we said, naked ladies, and surprise lily is another one. But whatever their name, they look beautiful and smell wonderful. So add some surprise lilies to your garden if you don't already grow them. Over in the community garden plot, shishito peppers are putting out several fruits. So we're trying to figure out what to do with them, what recipes to use them in. If you have any shishito pepper tips or recipes, let us know. And around the area and the DC region, we have lots of different fall festivals being announced in our garden world. So coming up is the Friends of Brookside Gardens, and that's of course at Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland, annual plant sale. And that's Saturday the 11th and 12th of September, 10 to 3 and 10 to 1 respectively. And of course, if you are a member of Friends of Brookside, you get first dibs. So I highly recommend joining that organization. Across the Beltway at Green Spring Gardens in Alexandria, Virginia, their fall plant sale is taking place this year on Saturday 25th from 9 to 3 p.m. So mark your calendar for that one. And then a new event has just been announced, and that is Saturday, October 2nd at the National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. It is the Friends of the National Arboretum's bulb sale, and those would be bulbs that are blooming in the springtime that you are planting this fall. So I would say go early for best selection. We'll hopefully have more details on the FONA bulb sale in coming weeks. And one last event that's near and dear to my heart that I wanted to mention that is open to anyone in the world, not just those in the DC area or the Mid-Atlantic USA, which is the annual Garden Conference. And that's for garden communicators of all kinds, whether you have a podcast, a blog, do garden photography, writing, YouTube channel, you're an influencer on social media. If you push plants, if you talk about gardening, this conference is for you, and it's taking place virtually. So that's why I say anybody in the world can attend, and that's August 11th through the 14th. And you can sign up for that at gardencom.org, and it's GARDENCOMM as in communicator.org. Happy gardening! Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at washingtongardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.